Addressing Gettysburg.
But that's the other thing too, is that how many guys leave to help a wounded guy? So you're losing a lot of men once the bullets start flying, because
generally a minimum of 2. It could be 4.
2 per wound.
Yeah.
Right? Is that what you're saying?
2 per. If you are utterly disabled, like you've been hitting the leg or something like that, it's going to take probably 2 men to carry you back.
3 per wound there.
And you're not going to carry that person very far if it's just 2 of you.
Right.
You're gonna need more than that. We did Barb and I did a program a number of years ago. That was one of the coolest things we ever did, where the first half of the program is we followed Willard's New York Brigade in its attack down into the Cadore Thicket on the July 2nd. And then we had picked out several soldiers from the brigade who were wounded. And then the second part of the program was we brought along a Civil War stretcher.
Oh, I remember hearing about this, yeah.
And we said, okay, we picked the smallest lady in the group. We said, you're wounded. And we picked the 4 strongest dudes in the group. And they couldn't make it without getting some relief from Cadore Thicket to the Weikert Farm.
I believe it.
They were just streaming in sweat coming down, and I was like, holy cow, man.
And what would you have, 1 guy per handle, or would they just switch off?
1 guy per handle. So they needed
4 guys carrying 1 small lady.
Yeah, they needed some people to come in and relieve some of them.
Wow.
To carry it. So,
Jeez.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's got to be really difficult to do, though, over rough ground.
Oh, man.
Back when you were allowed to go on the rough ground in the park.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of Addressing Gettysburg, coming to you from the CWI's 2024 Summer Conference. And with me today is a legend in the history field, someone that many of us grew up watching on shows on a History Channel. And if you were a frequent visitor to Gettysburg and you enjoyed the interpretive programs, he was the brains behind them, and that's Scott Hartwig right here. Most recently, of course, he has put out 2 giant tomes on the Battle of Antietam, to Antietam Creek, and I Dread the Thought of the Place. Right. Scott Hartwig, once again on the show. Welcome, Scott.
Good to be here, Matt.
Okay, 2 Antietam Creek and I Dread the Thought of the Place are going well, I think, because I hear a lot of people talking about them. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I just met an 8th grader down at the book signing. I'm sure he got...
He did.
Yeah.
I met him.
And he already read 2 Antietam Creek.
He read I Dread the Thought of the Place.
Oh, right, and he's going backwards.
2 Antietam Creeks, reading that now.
Yeah, and I have not been able to finish, not because it's bad or anything, it's just because it's so big, and I have such ADD, and by nature because of this work. But what I've read so far, I love it, and the reason I do is because it's got 2 of my favorite things. Usually you find them in 2 separate works, but I would say this is like a mix between Coddington and like a Sears or Trudeau or something, in that you have a lot of, it's rich in information and detail on the maybe statistical or military side of things, but it also, you write very well and it's very easy to read. Yeah. You pick really, really interesting details about soldiers and incidents within the battle or whatever to talk about. And I know we've had you on before to talk about the writing process, mm-hmm. and then you did a thing over the winter with Chris Gwynn about that. So we're not going to rehash that. But you did a lecture last night. Now, unfortunately, I had to go somewhere, so I couldn't see it. But you discussed more of the soldier's experience at Antietam.
Yeah.
The title, I Dread the Thought of the Place, is Rufus Dawes,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you know, he's been in some battles, but where does that line come from, though? Where are they? They're heading here, aren't they?
It was on June 18th, 1863, during the Gettysburg campaign, and they marched into Maryland, and the brigade was going into bivouac, and he said the newsboys somehow got a hold of, I forget which newspaper it was, the New York Tribune or Herald, something like that, or the Times, and he got a copy of the paper from the newsboy who was running through camp. By the way, I found that to be really interesting, because a lot of times we think the life of a Civil War soldier was unbelievably primitive.
Right.
But here is a unit on the march in the midst of a campaign going into bivouac, and somehow the newsboy has got a hold of the newspaper from probably the day before,
Right.
and is running through camp, hawking the paper. Dawes buys a copy of the paper. When he looks at the paper, it says, you know, rebels in Pennsylvania, another battle at Antietam on Tappas, is what it says.
Okay.
And then he goes, you know, I hope not. The flower of our regiment was slaughtered in that terrible cornfield. I never want to fight there again. I dread the thought of the place. And I never forgot that quote.
Yeah.
So when I started working on this book, I was like, that is the title of the book.
Yeah.
Because that captures how so many men who were in real serious combat at Antietam remembered the battle. And it, I think a lot of times, one of the things I talked about last night is that the American Civil War is unusual in America's wars, in that Americans tend to see it with a rosy hue.
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah, it was a war. Yeah, there were lots of casualties. People got killed and they got wounded, but, you know, there just wasn't, like, it wasn't as mean as, say, World War II,
Right.
World War I, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Vietnam, or whatever it was. And Dawes is a reminder that it was.
Mm-hmm.
It was every inch as mean. And that's part of what I tried to do in this talk last night. I used a number of letters that were written by soldiers after the battle, not long after, but shortly after the battle, when the battle's still very fresh in their mind, the emotions were still really raw. And it helps you get at how they really felt about the battle, but also the nature of the battle. So some of the things in some of the letters, I think, probably surprised people. There was one Union soldier who was proud of the fact that he was certain he had killed 3 Confederates, and he was also pretty certain he had shot a lot of others. And then at Antietam, they came up in the rear of Confederate soldiers who were fighting with the 6th and 2nd Wisconsin. He was in the 7th Wisconsin. And he said, we fired 20 rounds into them before they even found out where we were. They couldn't figure out where we were. And then when they found out where we were, he said, then they started throwing their rifles down and running for the woods to get the cover. And he said, we just gunned them down.
Huh.
He says, we wasn't in for taking prisoners.
Yeah.
He says, even a wounded man couldn't get off without being plugged by a Mini. Well, he may have exaggerated some of this,
Okay.
but the point I was trying to make to the people last night is that you always have to understand the context of these things. Is that 3 nights before this, on September 14th, the 7th Wisconsin was executing a maneuver in the Battle of South Mountain to attack Confederate soldiers who were south of the National Road leading up into Turner's Gap. What they didn't know is behind a stone wall on their flank and rear were all these Confederates. And they waited until the 7th Wisconsin was in their most exposed position. Then they just poured it into them. And what you don't know, because a lot of times people don't tell all the details, like this soldier was telling his friend, that maybe the Confederates shot some of the wounded guys. We don't know. Or maybe they didn't, weren't letting soldiers get away. Or maybe they weren't trying to take prisoners. But it's also possible that the 7th Wisconsin was like, oh yeah, this is payback time.
Yeah.
So when we hear something like that, that shakes our idea of what we think the war was like,
Right.
what we think a battle like Antietam was like. So that was part of what I was trying to do. And I think Dawes, in that one sentence, he captures just so much of how many of these soldiers remembered this battle, that it was just it was a really traumatic experience for them.
But now these guys have been, not all of them, I'm sure there's some green ones, but they've been through many battles, and just because they're not thought of as the bloodiest day or the bloodiest battle, they were nonetheless pretty bloody and horrible to go through. But what is it that you think about Antietam that makes it so horrendous for them?
It was the scale of the slaughter. The scale eclipsed anything any of these men had ever seen before. And the other thing was, I mean, even the Confederates were that way. Because the thing is that almost all the battlefields previous to Antietam, the Confederates controlled the battlefield. So they were the ones who were cleaning up the battlefield, and they're the ones who saw the aftermath of the battle. The Union soldiers did see some of it, but they didn't see as much as they did in Antietam. So Antietam was the first time you really had a good chance to walk over the field and see, like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. But the other part of it was, and this reoccurs in letter after letter after letter that these guys are writing immediately after the battle. They're just stunned at the scale of the slaughter. It is stunning to them. Yeah. I mean, down at the Sunken Lane, numerous Union soldiers talk about, they get to the lane, they're like, if I didn't see it, I wouldn't believe it.
Right.
There's a Union soldier in Sedgwick's division that passed over the dead of Alfred Colquitt's brigade, who just got slaughtered by this flanking attack. They were on the north end of the cornfield. And he's writing in this letter to a friend of his, he said, if I hadn't witnessed it with my own eyes, I couldn't have believed that this was true.
Yeah.
There were so many dead men laying there in a line. It shook him. And a lot of Sedgwick's men also mentioned they passed kind of perpendicular to where all the fighting had been in the cornfield and the meadows south of the cornfield. And everybody who wrote about it all mentioned that it was unbelievable to them how many dead and wounded were in the field. They were all over the place. And they're having to step over these guys and walk around them. And then a lot of guys are like, oh, give me water, please. Please get me out of here. You know,
it's the wounded that's got to be the worst.
You're having to walk over these guys. There's a captain in the 43rd New York who he commands a picket detail. And he spends the night south of the cornfield, immediately south of the cornfield, on property that the Save Historic Antietam Foundation and the American Battlefield Trust acquired just like 3-4 years ago. Wow. It's really a cool area. There was a tremendous amount of fighting there, but it used to be a house and some other sheds and things like it was privately owned. Nobody went down there and nobody interpreted it. But this captain describes his experience. It's really dark, and all around him are these people begging to have their life ended for water. And then he has to go around and wake up his picket reserve. There's dead men everywhere. So frequently he's going over, oh, no, not one of my men. This guy's dead. Or this, oh my God. And he says, he writes to his father, he says, I feel like I've aged 20 years.
I bet.
And then eventually this captain resigns from the service. And maybe it's not all just Antietam. He's not even in like the serious fighting. He came up with the 6th Corps, but he's where all the carnage occurred. And it just was, I think it was really, really disturbing to these men. Another thing I did in the program last night is there were several different soldiers who talked about God. You know, one Alabaman who was in the Sunken Lane, who escaped from the Sunken Lane, and he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe he survived. He just was astounded that he was alive. And he said, I would have fallen on my knees and thanked God. Because you can understand why he thought that. He's like, how did I escape? It had to be God. God wanted me to escape. God wanted me to survive.
Yeah.
And but then there's another soldier who's on a burial detail. His best friend was killed. He was in the 82nd New York. And he describes the burial of his friend. They find his friend. They bury his friend. And he writes at the end of this really heartfelt thing about how this is just, he'll never get over this. You know, all these things, you see, they took all these things, which soldiers always do. They take the rings off, they take your wallet, they take all these little things that he said meant so much to him. And he's just laying there, he's dead, and they have to bury him, and he says, tears are just pouring down my face, and he says, why does God allow this damnable thing called war? So his reaction is totally different.
Yeah.
And then there's another soldier who's a captain in the 14th Indiana, and he writes, you know, we can't figure this out, all right? I don't know why all these men in my company were killed and why all this stuff happened to us. God reigns, and we don't understand it. And that's just the way it is. So all these men, because of the scale of slaughter and what the way they were raised in whatever religious denomination they were in, but all these men who are religious are really grappling with their faith because they're like, how did this happen?
Yeah.
How did God allow this to happen? I don't understand this. Why did God let me live when my comrade was killed right beside me? I don't understand that. So it also, I think, for a lot of these soldiers, now some soldiers will double down on their faith, and some soldiers' faith is going to be shaken by a result of it. It's not all one thing or all another thing.
Yeah.
But it does definitely make them think, what is going on? How is this allowed to happen?
And do we see that in previous battle or after previous battles? I mean, I know you didn't go and study every battle to do this book, but like in your readings elsewhere, like have you come across letters expressing that so much after, say, Second Manassas or?
You probably did, but it depended upon the unit. But again, after Second Manassas, you know, if you're a Union soldier, you're driven from the field. So a lot of what you're dwelling on is my comrades are out there. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know how they're being taken care of. So the Confederate soldiers, some of them may have been trying to grapple with, and the way a lot of Confederate soldiers rationalized it is these people are the invaders. They're the invaders. So, I mean, this is a terrible business, but it's a necessary business because we have to repel the invaders. And that's what I'm going to convince myself of. That's what I believe. And also, you know, sometimes with some Confederate soldiers, like after Antietam, I mean, their physical condition was so bad that they didn't have really time to dwell upon the tragedies that they had observed and witnessed. They were so worried about, can I get some food?
They were
I
like
need some
starving.
clothing.
Yeah.
I need some
Yeah.
shelter.
Yeah.
You know, so, but, you know, like after Gettysburg, you do find some soldiers, but they're more resigned at that point to,
It's like, this is awful.
this is what it is.
Yeah.
And to me, this is when, you know, everybody loves everybody's a hero. They're all heroes. Everybody's a hero.
Sure.
Right. But to me, the real heroes of the war, and you can apply this to both sides, are the people who go through an Antietam and a Fredericksburg and a Gaines Mill and a Second Manassas, and they do it again. Because they know that their number might be up the next time. And it's very hard to get into that mindset. Now, my oldest son was in the 4th Infantry Division, 22nd Infantry in Iraq and Vietnam, not Vietnam, and Iraq and Afghanistan.
How old is he?
Yeah, no, not that old. I'm 105. He was in Afghanistan as well, and he had an apartment down at Fort Hood with 2 other lieutenants. So there were 3 lieutenants in this apartment. And I went down to get his truck when he was getting ready to deploy to Iraq. And I was going to drive his truck home from Fort Hood. And I remember being struck that these guys were all really intelligent people. And they all totally understood the risk that they were about to embark upon.
Right.
But they were like, this is what we trained for. Yeah, we know that it's risky. Yeah, we know. This is what we trained for. And I think what happens with a lot of these soldiers is that, obviously you have some soldiers who, I write about this in the book, their glass gets filled and they got nothing left to give and they can't do it anymore and they desert or they go crazy or something happens to them. But your best soldiers, I think, are ones who are like, I'm just not going to sit around and think about the risks. This is my job. I'm a soldier, and I'm going to do my job.
Yeah.
And, yeah, there's a lot of risks. But as John Gibbons said one time, he said this actually to a soldier during the cannonade, this soldier was laying down with his face on the ground. He was just terrified. And Gibbons said to him, during the bombardment, July 3rd, he goes, all this is in the hands of God. So you just do your duty.
Yeah.
So if you're going to get it, you're going to get it. Now, I mean, Gibbon, of course, took precautions. You don't want to be stupid about it.
Sure.
But
Right.
I think that's, those are the people who, to me, are the real heroes, are the ones who are, they know what the risk is because they've seen it and they stay in and they'll do it again. After Antietam, they're going to do it again at Fredericksburg. So, yeah, I mean, that stuff is very interesting.
So you mentioned before that after the battle, the Confederates were so starved that they didn't have the time to dwell on what they had just gone through. Just how bad was the condition of the Confederate Army, and also what was their strength? How large were they?
Yeah, the strength of the Army in the battle was about 40,000 men. That's the effectives that fought the battle. And another thing to keep in mind about the Confederate Army is that a lot of their non-combat jobs could be done by enslaved labor because, a lot of these men brought slaves with them, and they did a lot of the non-combat sort of jobs. Although they did detail some men, like there's a number of accounts that I read of Confederate soldiers who were detailed from their unit to go cook food or something like that. So it wasn't all of it was done by enslaved labor, but some of it was. Whereas the Union Army had to detail men from line units to do all non-combat jobs. So it's a little bit different. But the problem with the Confederate Army is their logistics system didn't exist in Maryland. So Lee, when he went into Maryland, thought that he was going to be able to purchase food from the Marylanders. And the way you'd purchase food is you would give, the community or the farmer a receipt, and then he could file a receipt with the Confederate government, and then he would eventually get reimbursed for it.
Right.
And you know how that went. That went really well. Yeah, went really well.
Did he think that Marylanders were going to flock to Swelter's ranks? He didn't think
no,
that.
absolutely. That's another myth. Another myth is that he thought Marylanders were going to flock to the. He had met with one of his officers who was from Frederick, Maryland, before they entered Maryland, and this officer told him, he said, don't expect any support. This is a very unionist country.
Okay.
So there is some people who are sympathetic to the Confederacy, but they're way outnumbered by the Yankees who are up here. So Lee knew he wasn't going to get many recruits. He wasn't going to have a lot of support. But he thought, hey, people always want money. So if I promise them they're going to get money, but they didn't want their money, right? So they didn't want their money, and they didn't want them to be there. They wanted them to leave.
Right.
So I always like to point out that, when people say, all this damage and destruction and everything like that the Union Army caused by the Battle of Antietam, I'm like, hey, man, they didn't choose the battlefield.
Right, yeah.
Robert E. Lee chose the battlefield, and he had issued a proclamation to the people of Maryland when he was in Frederick that said, we will honor however you feel. Well, they let them know pretty clearly how they felt. Please leave. And what he showed to them is that, no, when strategic considerations enter into this, we're not leaving.
Right.
Because we're fighting for our independence, and I'm sorry, we're going to fight a battle in one of your communities and bring a calamity to your community. And that was a choice. Now, we have to realize this is a war. These sorts of things are going to happen. But so Lee has this, he fights this battle. His army is poorly supplied. They're making really hard marches, like encircle Harper's Ferry and, defend the South Mountain passes. And these marches, you'll read these marches, or like the all-night march that Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson's division make from Harper's Ferry up to Sharpsburg. And some of these men in McLaws's division have had no food for 2 days. So you tell people, like, okay, don't eat anything for 2 days, have a few sips of water, and then march in an all-night march where it's pitch black for 14 miles, and then go into a battle.
And by the way, that road is windy and hilly.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So
Right.
you're going up. I mean, I can't imagine that. And I know, like, I've said this before on the show, but the longer I think about it, I think the more naive I think I am when I say this. But, like, a lot of these guys are in their 20s, and you can handle a lot in your 20s to an extent.
To an extent.
And I don't think especially if these guys are all something I remember reading somewhere. They're picking corn and fruit and stuff along the way and eating it just to eat, but they're on the brink of starvation. So all it really does is give them diarrhea.
Well, there was some fruit, there were some apples and things like that. But I mean, Lee enforced in 1862 really strict discipline on his troops, so that there's some accounts from Marylanders who were like, the troops would be standing right next to an apple orchard and nobody would touch any of the apples because the officers wouldn't let them. And there's another story when, after they entered Maryland, D.H. Hill turned one of his brigades loose into a cornfield because he'd negotiated with the farmer to get the rations. He's like, get your rations. On the night before the Battle of Antietam, there's a letter from a fellow who was detailed from the 11th Mississippi in Hood's division. They went into Miller's cornfield and got corn out of the cornfield, and they found pumpkins, and then that was the rations. That was the rations that the men in their regiment, at least, received on the morning of the 17th, because it took them all night to cook this stuff up.
Yeah.
So anyway, and they were drinking bad water frequently.
Yeah.
So your gut is churning constantly. And soldiers just reached the point, a lot of these men just reached the point, they had nothing in the gas tank. So they straggle, and they're like, hey, I'm in no hurry to get back. And so after Lee retreats back into Virginia, he crosses the river near Shepherdstown. He still has this pipe dream that he's going to maneuver the army up to Hagerstown and re-enter Maryland on McClellan's flank. And it's the Battle of Shepherdstown that opens his eyes. So what happens in the Battle of Shepherdstown is on the 19th of September, John Porter executes just like a textbook river crossing against the Confederate defenders there, which was two very small infantry brigades that were demoralized by Sharpsburg, and a whole bunch of reserve artillery. And it's a debacle for the Confederates. William Nelson Pendleton is the commander of it. He mismanages the defense badly, and they capture some of the guns, and they make this crossing on the river. And then they withdraw back across the river. And but Pendleton reports to Lee that he's lost all the reserve artillery of the army. All.
God.
Which he hadn't.
Okay.
But he had no idea what had actually happened because he'd fled the battlefield. So anyway, it's a real disaster. And then Lee is like, okay, we got to get this back. We're going to drive them over the river. We're going to counterattack. So on September 20th, John Porter, as well as he handled everything the day before, he handles it really badly on the 20th. He sends 2 brigades across. He doesn't have unified command, so each brigade reports to a different division commander. The one division commander doesn't cross the river. The other division commander does cross the river. He manages his troops really, really well. The other troops aren't managed as well. They're slow in withdrawing, and they get counterattacked, and one of the regiments gets really badly mauled. But back to the Confederates, when Lee tries to find a unit that can execute a counterattack, the army is just utterly dysfunctional that night, September 19th. I mean, it's just literally dysfunctional. And ultimately, they're able to come upon one division, A.P. Hill's, that is in combat condition to execute the attack. And they do. And it's a really significant moment. It's in the scale of Civil War battles, it's not a really super bloody battle. But what it does is it convinces McClellan the Confederates are really strong.
Okay.
They're really strong. They're really aggressive. I have to be very cautious because they could attack me at any time, not realizing that Lee didn't have anybody else that could have made that counterattack and succeeded.
That was it.
And then what he does is he withdraws down to Opequon Creek, a little bit north of Winchester, and his strategy is, which was really, really smart, he pushes his cavalry pickets right up to the Potomac. He acts aggressive. I'm strong. I'm very strong. Don't mess with me. Meanwhile, he starts sending out details to go gather food. And then they start these, they're like cattle drives to gather the stragglers. It is mind-blowing how many stragglers they find. Officers, enlisted men, thousands of them. It's an Army Corps worth of stragglers that they find.
Just everywhere they go.
So what happens is McClellan acts very timid, cautious. He thinks the rebels are strong, powerful. And one of the criticisms I make of McClellan is that he had prisoners from every division in Lee's army after the battle was over, wounded and unwounded, every division. So the first thing you do, this is not rocket science, and the only person who would actually start to institute this was Joe Hooker when he takes command of the army. First thing you do is you question the POWs and you find out what unit do you belong to. Now you have their order of battle.
Right.
That's gold.
Yeah.
You got their order of battle. The second thing you do is like, yeah, how often do you get your rations? I mean, what's the food like? Oh, it's terrible, man. We don't get any resupply of clothing. Our food's bad. We're starving to death, blah, blah, blah. Oh, their logistics are bad.
Right.
That's gold.
Right.
And then the third part is like, well, how strong was your unit? Remember, these guys aren't trained not to tell you anything. Some of them aren't going to tell you anything, but some of them are like, well, I don't know. We had about, 200 guys in my regiment, maybe 400 in the brigade, something like that. Well, what you do is you start to put together an idea of the strength of the Confederate Army. If McClellan had done that, just that simple thing, he would have understood that Lee was vulnerable.
Yeah.
And he was weak. And this was a time. Maybe you don't want to fight another battle, but what you do want to do is you want to cross the Potomac River. There's a risk to that, no question. Yes, you have your own supply problems, but you're trying to win this war, which means you have to take risks. So crowd him, push him. Don't let him just wander around, gather his supplies, collect his stragglers. Because the other thing, the way it worked in that period, so if the Union Army had marched into Winchester, let's say Lee had withdrawn way, way up the Shenandoah Valley, right, long way away. Mm-hmm. So the Union Army marches into Winchester and they come to a hospital, and let's say there's 1,600 Confederate wounded in the hospital. What they're going to do is they're going to walk through and they're going to parole every man in that hospital. That means you legally cannot take up arms against the Union again until you've been exchanged or you've met your parole. So what those men are going to do is they can take their parole and they're going to go home. Now the Confederacy has to go get them and bring them back. Mm. So Lee does not want the men paroled. So that's the other reason he has to stay, far up towards the Potomac River. And ultimately, it works. You can look at the strength returns of the Army of Northern Virginia for every 2 weeks after the Battle of Antietam, and the Army just steadily grows from less than 40,000 men to almost 70,000 men.
Wow.
By November.
Jeez.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing they weren't crushed. Well, I guess had McClellan been aware.
They had a really strong position at Antietam. They had a very strong position.
Yeah, sure.
And Lee managed the troops that he did have extremely well. Yeah. So that almost every point that the Federals attacked, Lee met them with a fairly strong force.
And he was moving them all around, right? To meet these. Yeah.
Lee. James Longstreet wrote after the war. He said every major movement of troops in Antietam was ordered by Lee. So it wasn't like Jackson and Longstreet were manipulating troops around. They did order some local counterattacks, particularly in Longstreet's case, but the major movements of troops were all done by Lee.
So these guys are, yes, they're in a good position, but they're outnumbered. They're weak physically. And then on top of that, Lee is working them like dogs. Yeah. Moving them to weak points in the line as needed, back and forth, and like that. It really is remarkable that they were able to fight at all.
Oh, yeah. And the thing that's also remarkable about it is there's numerous Union officers who on September 18th, if they're writing in their journal, or September 19th, they're writing about McClellan's decision not to attack again. They're like, man, that was a good decision. Yeah. Because we were outnumbered.
Oh, really?
Because the Confederates, depending on where you were, like let's say you were in John Sedgwick's division and you had like 5,700 men in the division. It's a really strong division, really good unit. But you got hit by a force that was smaller than yours. But the aggressiveness with which they struck you and the fact that they hit you on your flank and in your front led most of the men in Sedgwick's division to believe we got overwhelmed by numbers. What they were overwhelmed by was the Confederates were in a better position and were able to do all this damage to them. But you can see how these soldiers then, when they're assessing the battle immediately afterwards, are like, man, they had like equal numbers to us. Not realizing that there were sectors of the battlefield that Lee had literally no troops because he'd stripped it to send all these guys over. So, and it was also the reason why on September 18th, Lee's orders to his army were defend your position, but do nothing to initiate an attack by the enemy. So lay low. So if they attack you, then you have to defend.
Right.
But don't skirmish with them, just be quiet, because he did not want a battle. He knew he was going to have to retreat. He just didn't want a battle on the 18th of September.
I mean, you're a learned guy, you know a lot of stuff already, but you'd been working on the first book for 20 years, you said?
Yeah, that took a little while.
A little while. So, what's the one thing though that you discovered, whether it be for yourself or for, posterity's sake, that surprised you about the Battle of Antietam or the soldiers' experience in the Battle of Antietam?
Yeah, there were a number of things. I mean, the soldiers were incredibly resilient, many of them. I mean, it was amazing how resilient a lot of these guys were. But the other part about it was how many people behaved with incredible heroism and how many people utterly failed.
Yeah.
So again, we like to think that, they're all heroes and everybody did their duty, and they didn't all do their duty. I mean, and I felt it was important in telling the story in this book to tell the whole story and to explore, why some of these people had failed. But it's just, the other thing about it is you're just kind of left stupefied that we were capable of this type of violence.
Yeah.
And it's just such a tragedy, And I remember when I was working on the chapters about Sedgwick's division, it didn't matter how many times I was going over it. Every time I went over it, you were like, don't go in there.
Yeah.
Don't do this.
Yeah.
You know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know what's going to happen, and you just, but yeah, I think it's kind of hard to describe. And another thing I remember in the work on the book, I read through all these letters, or hundreds of letters, that were written by Union and Confederate veterans to John Gould, who was the adjutant of the 10th Maine, and John Gould had set up this huge project that originally had started because John Gould was trying to gather information about who had shot Joseph Mansfield, the 12th Corps commander. Mm-hmm. Because Gould was one of the people, he was shot in front of the 10th Maine, and Gould was one of the people who helped him off the field after he was shot. And then there was this controversy after the war. It was kind of ridiculous. All these people were like, no, he wasn't shot near you. He was shot in front of us. We saw him shot. Anyway, so Gould was like, all right, you know what? Let's find out what happened. So he started writing. And, he just got an unbelievable response from all these vets, Union and Confederate, who were willing to share these really phenomenal details with him. Because he wasn't, like when we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and John Batchelder, the famous historian at Gettysburg, John Batchelder was writing the history of the battle. So if you were writing to John Batchelder, what you might write to him is going to be different than what you write to John Gould. Because John Gould just wants to know what happened in a battle. He's just looking for information.
Right.
And he knows the battle really, really well. And he's a veteran. So what you're going to tell John Gould might be different than what you would write to John Batchelder. So these letters to Gould were, they're just fascinating. I remember I came home, when I finally finished reading through all of them, taking notes and all this stuff and everything like that, I came home and I said to my wife, I said, I'm really going to miss those guys. Because it was something with the way, there was an utter lack of animosity amongst most of these men. I mean, one guy I remember, he wrote to Gould, he was a Texan, and he says, in 1862, I'd have shot you dead. But he says, now, war's over. And then he even had one Confederate soldier who wrote him, generally you didn't see this, but one who wrote him, he says, we have to admit, the cause we fought for was wrong. And but he also had these Confederates who were like, hey, you need to move down here, man. Hey, my daughter's getting married. We want you to come to the wedding. And it was just amazing. And then the Union vets who were writing to him, the details that they told him. But there was kind of they saw the world in a very clear way. And they weren't tooting their horn. They weren't saying, hey, look at me, how great I am. I'm a veteran. I was at Antietam. I'm wearing my hat and all my red regalia and stuff like that. They just were low-key about it, but proud of what they'd done, sad for what they'd lost, and there was something very likable about them. Because, I mean, we live in a world where everybody's trying to be noticed and, wants to appear on TikTok and YouTube and everything like that and, be famous. And these guys were refreshing.
They were humble.
They were very humble.
Yeah.
Most of them. I mean, sometimes. And Gould and his compatriot was Ezra Carman, who was the historian at Antietam. Yeah. He was also a veteran of the battle. They could pick out, the tall tale boys in an instant. And
sure, yeah.
And they had a great sense of humor. They would write these funny comments in the margins sometimes of the letters that they would receive. It was really, really great stuff.
Last question I'll ask you. Over the winter, you did a winter lecture here at the park. Chris Gwynn interviewed you, and I was going through all the lectures a couple weeks ago, making these little shorts for YouTube. And I was skimming through yours, and you said something about the fools that won a civil war. Mm-hmm. And first of all, what's your point about that? Because there are there's a number of people I see online that are excited at the prospect of one.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this, because I ask a lot of historians who are far more intelligent than I this question all the time. Do you see the makings of one in today's society? In other words, would you, if someone said we're in 1859, would you agree or disagree?
I would disagree.
Okay, why?
Because the issue that we have today is completely invented. It's just invented.
Go on.
There isn't an issue. There isn't like one party isn't, a bunch of communists that are destroying our nation. We're not going to destroy our nation. There isn't some policy that anybody is pursuing from now to the past that is going to destroy our nation. We don't have an issue like slavery. That's the key thing. And that you also had, our nation is actually pretty homogenous. I mean, you could plop me down in some town in Kansas, and I guarantee they probably got a Chick-fil-A and a Walmart and
several McDonald's and 7-Elevens.
And one of the entryways into that town looks exactly like the entryway coming in on 30 East into Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And so, but in America before the Civil War, there was a profound difference between the society in the South and the society in the North. Mm-hmm. Huge difference. And and also you did have, like you have today, where you had very partisan media that could help fuel.
Yeah, that's nothing new.
That's nothing
Everybody
new.
thinks it is.
That's nothing new. I mean, we went through a period that a lot of us remember where the media wasn't partisan, right? And
we believed it wasn't.
Right. I don't think it really was.
Okay.
I think it was. They tried to be pretty balanced. But today we definitely have some really partisan media. We have some really good media. But in that period before the Civil War, a lot of it was very partisan. And if you were a Southerner, for example, there was no freedom of the press in the South. Mm-hmm. Now, there was freedom of press in the North.
Yeah.
There was not freedom of press in the South. So you couldn't just pick up an abolitionist tract and start reading it. They were forbidden.
Sure.
Right? So you had a completely different world than we have today. And I think that, there are some crazy people out there who would probably think that a war is a good idea. And the point I was trying to make with Chris is that when you read this book, and particularly when you read the aftermath chapters, if you think a war is a good idea, you are the biggest damn fool that we have ever seen.
I agree.
Because most frequently, nothing good comes out of a war.
Yeah.
Occasionally, like in the American Civil War, it preserved the Union and it destroyed slavery. There was something that good came out of that. In World War II, they overthrew the Nazi regime and the Japanese imperialism, and yes, that is true. But the cost to do that is so profound that, and we have a society today that most of the people in our society have never been in the military. And many of them who have been in the military were not in combat arms. And they have a distorted idea of what it is to be in the military or to fight a war or something like that. And that's why I say, man, you should read some history.
Yeah.
Because that will take the starch out of your enthusiasm pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. and these are good books to start with, is the point, I think, right? Mike Lentz is one of the people who's dying for a civil war. Oh, no? Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. Yeah.
Second one especially. Anfield was hard to get through.
Yeah.
And I came away going, how does anyone survive that?
Well, this is one of the things I talked about last night, and one of the letters that I had is I encountered numerous soldiers who mentioned that every man in the unit had bullet holes in their clothing or they'd been hit by spent balls. Jesus. Every man. So that it just tells you that it was just sheer luck that you weren't hit.
Yeah.
A lot of these units.
That's what's so amazing to me. It's just like the wall of bullets coming at you. I mean, how do you not get hit? But I mean, they did. If they got holes in their jackets, I mean, they were basically hit.
And also, I mean, the other thing that's, it all becomes relative, when you have the scale of fighting like at Antietam. So one of the letters I read last night, this captain of the 14th Indiana, he's writing his mother, September 30th, and he tells her, he says, I got wounded. He goes, I had a bullet, hit me in the left arm, it lodged near the bone. Surgeon dug it out, gave me the bullet. I got it in my left pocket right now. He goes, look, don't start. It's only a scratch. Only a scratch. So you read that and you're like, what? And then you start to read the rest of his letter. And one of his men gets shot in the brain, killed instantly. Another guy gets hit in the heart. His blood's pouring out of his body. And he says to the men, he goes, don't mind me. I'm going to die. You get to retribution. He says, goodbye, boys. Goodbye, Captain, as the captain's going over to try to catch him. Those were dead.
Oh, my God.
You see that? This bullet wound? That was a scratch.
Yeah, right. It's
Right.
nothing.
So
yeah.
that's why I think it's all relative. So I mean, if he was the only guy wounded in the entire regiment, and this was the first battle they were ever in, everybody'd be like, oh my God, what was it, that wound you got? Oh man. But Antietam, it just, yeah, it is. It is. Some of these phases of the battle, you're just like, and the soldiers felt the same way that you do. Like, I don't know how I got out of that. So, alive.
Yeah, really. I mean,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's so hard to imagine.
It's almost impossible to imagine.
It is impossible
Yeah.
to imagine.
Yeah.
But what's hard for me to imagine, but I think I might be able to, is that these guys can function afterwards in any way that resembles normal. You know what I mean?
I didn't get into this last night. I should have, and I completely forgot about it. They had a period, so they go from September 17th to December 13th before there's a major battle again. So they were really in contact with the enemy and taking a lot of casualties. And so the soldiers had a long time amongst themselves to talk over what they'd been through. And that is unbelievably healing.
Yeah.
So this past winter, I read Jared Frederick had published the letters of Dick Winters
Yes.
to this woman in North Carolina who was a friend of his. And one letter in there really, really stuck out to me. It was so interesting. The war's over, and they're in Germany, and they're waiting to be demobilized and sent home. And he said, we're sitting around. What do you think we talk about? We talk about the battles we were in. We talk about the people we knew got killed or wounded, but we talk about the battles. And I was like, that's therapy.
Yes.
That's therapy for these men. That's how they grappled with what they had been through, talked it through amongst people who understood what they had experienced and healed from this. Now, you never forget it, but it brings you enough healing that you're able to continue to do your job again. You're able to go into Fredericksburg and fight the battle. And, guys like Rufus Dawes, Dawes is in all the big battles of the war. He never gets hit. Except one time he had a bullet singed his skin at Antietam running through the cornfield. He never gets hit. And then by the time they get down to Petersburg, the Oberlin campaign is over. He clearly is losing it. This one soldier who gets shot, he calls it murder. He realizes that he's really losing it. And then he resigns his commission when he's able to. And
Because he doesn't think he's effective anymore.
he leaves the Army.
Yeah.
But he's just losing it. He doesn't. He's just going to lose his mind. He just can't. He can't do it anymore. And sometimes if you look at the European campaign in World War II, and you look at the division corps leaders, not so much the Army commanders, there's very few of them who go through the entire campaign because they just can't. The pace is so great. The stress is so great. They just can't. They can't manage it. Now the enlisted men, they got to go through it. I just listened to this great show about the Battle of Cassino, talking to this author Matthew Parker, and Parker was saying that the Army had these psychology teams, and they went up amongst some of the infantry rifle companies who were in the Cassino sector to assess the emotional state of the men. And they found in most of these rifle companies that 100% of the men were psychologically seriously damaged. Like the guys were shaking and doing all these different things that people in the hospital were doing who were in there as psychological, battle trauma casualties.
Right.
So it tells you that, this sort of stuff, it depends on the circumstances. Like I would say for a soldier in the Civil War, the worst period of the war is going to be in 1864 when you're in constant contact. You're fighting all the time. You don't have this chance to kind of sort it out, what happened. But the soldiers of Antietam did have that, at least. That helped some of them.
Well, get a hold of these books, ladies and gentlemen. To Antietam Creek, and I Dread the Thought of the Place. Scott Hartwig. I'm telling you, if you like this interview, you're going to love these books. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Matt.
And we'll see you next time.